In this video I'm going to be inspecting the starter system located behind this cover and replacing the Bendix bushings with XRC bronze bushings. This is my 2019 KTM 250 TPI and it's currently done 55 hours. In the KTM service manual it recommends that you inspect the starter system every 80 hours or every 40 hours if used for motorsports. So I'm going to inspect it, and I thought this was a good opportunity to go ahead and replace the Bendix bushings with bronze bushings made by XRC. Okay, so I've taken off the skid plate and the bike is lying on its side, and before removing the ignition cover I recommend cleaning up any dirt around the sealing surfaces so it doesn't drop into the engine when you've got the cover off. And you also need to remove the gear shift, so I'm going to do that now. And now I'm ready to remove the ignition cover, and it's got lots of screws. They're all different lengths. So I always recommend making a template like this. When you take the screws off, you can put them in a template, and it makes it really easy when you come to reinstall them, so you know which goes where. And when removing them, I like to loosen them off first, partially, just to help prevent any warpage on the case or cover, and then you can go ahead and start removing them. Okay, so I've removed all the cover screws, and you can see there's two different lengths. There's a long screw here and here, and all the others are shorter. Okay, so now I'm ready to remove the cover, and it should come off relatively easily. And I'm just going to lift it off slowly. And that's what it looks like inside. Okay, so here you can see the starter motor shaft down here, which drives the Bendix. And when it's spinning, this part flies out and engages with the flywheel. The Bendix bushings, so there's one in the cover here, and from 2019, including 2020, it uses a longer bushing than previous models. And there's another bushing behind the Bendix, which you'll be able to see when I remove the Bendix. So to remove the Bendix, you just pull it out, and then you have to wriggle it around a little bit to get it out. But it will come out without taking out the starter motor. It's just a little bit of a puzzle. Okay, so there you can see it came out. Okay, so now you can see the two Bendix bushings. There's one here in the cover and one here in the case. And to remove these, I'm going to use a blank bearing puller. This is an 8mm puller. So I'm going to put that in, tighten it out, and pull it out with a slide hammer. And that removed the bushing pretty easily. And I'm using the same method to remove the cover bushing as well. Here you can see the two bushings I removed. As you can see, they're both the same depth. The actual measurement is 7.5 millimeters. The construction is the same as the older bushings. It's steel and it's been rolled, so you can see the slit in each bushing there, and then inside it's coated with a red coating to reduce friction. So my understanding is that the 2019 TPI bikes had a running change, so that the initial bikes had one long bushing and one standard length bushing, and the later ones had two long bushings. So XRC have two kits available. This one is labeled 2019 TPI, and it has one standard length bushing which is 4 millimeters deep and one long bushing which is 7.5 millimeters deep. And then the other kit available is the 2020 long bushing kit, which has two long bushings which are both 7.5 millimeters. As my bike had the 2 long bushings, I'm going to be using the 2020 kit. Really the only way you can tell what's in your 2019 is to take the ignition cover off and check what bushing's in there. In this table I've summarized which bushings can be used in which year bikes. And before I install the new bushings, I'm going to clean out the ignition cover bush bore and also the engine case bush bore. I'm going to use some parts cleaner and then blow it out with air. And one thing to note about the crankcase bushing install is the starter motor, which is here, has this collar, which if you need to swap out the starter motor, you need to be able to remove the collar. The XRC bushings have a flange which would normally overlap onto this collar. So what I do is file a second flat into the bushing so the collar can clear it without removing the bushing. I'll show you the modification on the bench. So here you can see a stock XRC bushing. It has one flat with a slot. This is intended to go up so that oil will collect here and then drain it into the bushing and lubricate the Bendix shaft. On the left we have a modified XRC bushing which has a second flat which I filed on it to clear the starter motor collar in case it needs to be removed. Okay, so I've cleaned out the bores where the bushes fit, and before I actually install them I'm going to do a test fit. So I'm using the install punch, holding the bush with my finger, and I just test whether the bush fits down in the bore easily or not. So the case one, it feels like a press fit, which is good, and the one I'm going to install in the cover is also a press fit. So if you find that the bushing fits loosely in the case, you can use some retaining compound. So I have 2 different types. Loctite 648 is intended for a close fit if there isn't much of a gap, and Loctite 638 is for a slip fit. So if the gap is larger, you can use the 638. It's very important that the bushes are held tightly in the cases, or that they will obviously wobble around and eventually wear the cases out and you'll have problems. So make sure the fit is good. If it's a press fit, you don't actually need to use any retaining compound, but I like to use a little bit anyway just to make sure it's held in place tightly. Okay, so I'm getting ready to install the crankcase bushing. I've applied some Loctite 648 to the outside of the bushing. You should be very careful not to get it inside the bushing. And as I mentioned, there's a flat with a slit which should go up, and the second flat which I created with a file to clear this collar goes down. So I just lightly pushed it in with my finger just to get the correct orientation, and then adjusted it, and then using the install punch you can hammer it in, and hammer it lightly. It shouldn't take a lot of force. Just until it's seated, and then check it's okay, and that looks good. Do not hammer it in hard, or you can deform the bush and then you have problems with it interfering with the Bendix shaft. And then the ignition cover bush, I've applied some Loctite 648 to the outer surface, being careful not to get any inside, and I've aligned the flat with the slit so it's parallel to the bottom surface. So this slit should be up. And then I'm going to install it using the punch tool supplied and lightly tap it home. Okay, and that looks good. Then once you've installed the bushings, if they're a press fit, you can go ahead and reinstall the Bendix straight away. But if they're a loose fit and you're using retaining compound to hold them in place, it's a good idea to wait 24 hours for the retaining compound to go off. Okay, so I'm now ready to install the Bendix, and before I do so, I'm going to lube up the Bendix gears and shaft, and also the bushing, starter motor and flywheel. And XRC recommend using Motorex 2000 spray lube. Unfortunately, that's not imported into Japan, so I'm going to be using this spray lube, which is a lightweight oil, And be sure to choose an oil that doesn't tack up. If it gets sticky, it's not good for the Bendix if it gets inside. It's a bit of a puzzle, but if you jiggle it around, it will go in without removing the starter motor. Okay, so now I'm ready to put the ignition cover on, and make sure the gasket is seated on the dowels. There's two, one here and here, and make sure there's no debris caught on the gasket. And then you can position the ignition cover in place and lower it down. And make sure it seats fully. If the Bendix isn't seated in the ignition cover properly, it'll stand proud, so make sure that goes fully down without applying force. And now I can insert the ignition cover screws. And I'm just going to tighten them lightly first, and then they need to be torqued to 10 Newton meters. And the last thing to do is install the shift lever. I've applied some Loctite 243, which is medium strength Loctite, to the screw, and I'm going to torque it to 14 Newton meters. And the last thing to check is that it starts okay. And I'll try again. So the Bendix is engaging perfectly, so I'm really pleased with that. If you'd like to purchase some XRC bronze Bendix bushings, they're available for sale on the Tokyo Off-Road web shop. I'll put a link in the description of the video. And with periodic lubrication, they should last a lifetime of the bike.